On the night of June 23, 1943, Junior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova sat in the open cockpit of her Polikarpov Po-2 biplane, waiting for darkness to deepen over the Ukrainian steppe. The aircraft beneath her was constructed primarily of plywood and canvas, a design dating from 1927, originally intended as a crop duster and primary trainer. It had a maximum speed of barely 94 miles per hour, no armor protection, no parachutes for the crew, and no radio communication equipment. The plane carried only 4 bombs, each weighing approximately 110 pounds, suspended beneath the lower wings. Popova was 21 years old. She had been flying combat missions for nearly a year as part of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, an all-female unit in the Soviet Air Force. Her navigator, sitting in the rear cockpit, was Katya Ryabova, age 19. Together, they had flown over 300 combat sorties, dropping bombs on German positions, supply depots, troop concentrations, and artillery batteries. Tonight's mission would target a German airfield approximately 30 miles behind enemy lines, where reconnaissance reported Messerschmitt fighters were based. The mission represented standard operations for the 588th Regiment. Take off after dark, navigate by moonlight and stars to the target area, cut the engine to glide silently over German positions, release bombs, restart the engine, and escape before German anti-aircraft guns could track them effectively. Return to base, reload, refuel, and repeat. Most crews flew between 5 and 8 missions per night. Some nights, when targets were close and weather permitted, crews completed 10 or 12 sorties before dawn. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches. German soldiers claimed they could hear the witches approaching, the sound of wind whistling through the biplane's wire bracing, creating an eerie swooshing noise as the Po-2 glided overhead in darkness. German commanders offered Iron Crosses to any pilot or anti-aircraft gunner who shot down a night witch. Despite flying obsolete aircraft without defensive armament, despite facing German fighters and anti-aircraft batteries, despite operating in all weather conditions throughout 3 years of war, the 588th Regiment flew over 23,000 combat sorties and dropped approximately 3,000 tons of bombs on German forces. This is the story of the Night Witches, the women who volunteered to fly the most dangerous missions in the Soviet Air Force, who terrified German soldiers with their nocturnal attacks, who proved that courage and determination transcended gender, and who earned distinction as one of the most decorated units in Soviet military history. 23 members of the regiment received the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor. Every member who survived the war received combat decorations. The unit never accepted male pilots or navigators. From its formation in October 1941 until victory in May 1945, the 588th remained exclusively female, the only Soviet combat regiment to maintain this distinction throughout the entire war. The creation of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment resulted from one woman's determination to mobilize Soviet women for combat aviation. Marina Mikhailovna Raskova was a legendary figure in Soviet aviation before the war began. She had been born in Moscow in 1912, the daughter of a singing teacher. Her father died when Marina was young, leaving her mother to raise her and her siblings in difficult circumstances. Marina developed early interest in aviation and chemistry, studying both subjects with passion. She became a chemistry teacher after finishing her education, but never abandoned her love for flying. Raskova learned to fly in her spare time during the early 1930s, joining one of the aviation clubs that proliferated across the Soviet Union during that era. The Soviet government encouraged aviation education as part of broader efforts to modernize the country and prepare for potential conflict. Flying clubs trained thousands of young Soviets in basic aviation skills, creating a pool of pilots that would prove valuable when war came. Raskova proved to be a natural pilot with exceptional navigation abilities. She became one of the first women in the Soviet Union to qualify as a navigator for the Soviet Air Force. During the late 1930s, Raskova participated in several record-breaking flights that brought her national fame. In September 1938, she served as navigator aboard a modified Ant-37 aircraft, attempting a non-stop flight from Moscow to Soviet Far East. The crew consisted of 3 women: pilot Valentina Grizodubova, co-pilot Polina Osipenko, and navigator Marina Raskova. The flight covered over 3,600 miles, setting a world distance record for female aviators. When fuel ran low before reaching their destination, Raskova bailed out to reduce weight, allowing the aircraft to continue. She parachuted into Siberian wilderness and survived for 10 days before rescue teams located her. The successful flight made Raskova a hero of the Soviet Union, one of the first women to receive the honor. She became a celebrity, giving speeches, teaching navigation, and serving as an inspiration to young women interested in aviation. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Raskova was working as a navigation instructor, teaching male pilots the skills they would need for combat operations. The German invasion shocked the Soviet Union. Despite warnings from intelligence services and clear signs of German preparations, the attack caught Soviet forces unprepared. German armored columns smashed through frontier defenses, penetrating hundreds of miles into Soviet territory within days. The Luftwaffe achieved complete air superiority, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground during surprise attacks on the first day of the invasion. Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in massive battles of annihilation. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the first months of the war. The Soviet people responded to the invasion with determination to resist. Millions of men volunteered or were conscripted into the Red Army. Factories were evacuated eastward, beyond German reach, to continue producing weapons and equipment. Women took jobs in factories, replacing men sent to the front. The entire Soviet economy mobilized for total war. But women who wanted to fight, who had aviation skills and wanted to use them against the invaders, found military regulations blocked their path to combat roles. Thousands of women applied to join combat aviation units during the summer and fall of 1941. They wrote letters to military commanders, aviation organizations, and government officials, requesting permission to fly combat missions. Most applications were rejected. Soviet military doctrine, like that of most nations during this era, considered women unsuitable for combat roles. Women could serve as nurses, radio operators, mechanics, and support personnel, but not as pilots, gunners, or infantry soldiers. This policy frustrated women like Raskova, who possessed combat-relevant skills but were prohibited from using them. Raskova decided to challenge this policy directly. She used her fame and connections to lobby for authorization to form all-female combat aviation units. She wrote directly to Joseph Stalin in September 1941, proposing the creation of 3 regiments: fighters, dive bombers, and night bombers, all staffed entirely by women, from pilots and navigators to mechanics and armorers. Raskova argued that Soviet women possessed the skills, courage, and determination necessary to fly combat missions effectively. She emphasized that using female aviators would release male pilots for other duties and would demonstrate Soviet commitment to equality between sexes. Stalin's decision to approve Raskova's proposal in October 1941 reflected the desperate circumstances facing the Soviet Union. German forces were approaching Moscow. Soviet casualties numbered in the millions. The Red Army faced equipment shortages and personnel losses that threatened its ability to continue fighting. Every available resource needed mobilization for the war effort. If women could fly combat missions, reducing strain on male pilot training programs, Stalin would authorize it. Order number 227, issued on October 8, 1941, established 3 female aviation regiments: the 586th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Dive Bomber Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Recruitment began immediately. Raskova personally selected candidates from thousands of applications. The response exceeded expectations, with women from across the Soviet Union volunteering, despite knowing combat aviation entailed extreme danger. Most applicants were young, many still teenagers or in their early 20s. They came from diverse backgrounds: university students, factory workers, teachers, athletes, collective farm workers. What united them was determination to fight the invaders and pre-existing aviation experience. Many had participated in flying clubs during the 1930s, learning basic piloting and navigation skills. Others had worked as flight instructors, aviation mechanics, or parachutists. Some were experienced pilots with hundreds of flying hours. Raskova evaluated applicants based on aviation background, physical fitness, educational level, and psychological suitability for combat. Many candidates had completed secondary education or university studies. Some held degrees in engineering, mathematics, or sciences. Others had trained as teachers or doctors before the war interrupted their careers. The educational level of female volunteers often exceeded that of male conscripts, reflecting the self-selection process. Women who volunteered for combat aviation tended to be highly motivated individuals with above-average education and strong determination. Raskova selected approximately 400 women for the 3 regiments. About 140 would staff the Night Bomber Regiment, with the remainder divided between fighters and dive bombers. The women reported to Engels, a city on the Volga River, in late October and early November 1941 for training. Engels hosted an aviation school that would provide facilities for instruction. The location offered several advantages. Distance from the front provided relative safety, good weather permitted regular flying, and existing infrastructure reduced setup time. The women arrived at Engels wearing civilian clothes, carrying whatever possessions they could transport. Most had said goodbye to families, not knowing when or if they would see them again. Some families opposed their daughters' decisions to volunteer for combat aviation, fearing they would be killed. Other families supported them, proud that their daughters would defend the motherland. Regardless of family attitudes, the women who reported to Engels shared determination to contribute to victory regardless of cost. Training began immediately, despite numerous obstacles. The aviation school lacked equipment sized appropriately for women. Uniforms came in men's sizes, forcing women to modify them extensively. Boots were too large, requiring multiple pairs of socks for proper fit. Flight gear designed for male aviators was similarly oversized. Leather flight jackets, helmets, and gloves all needed alterations. The women adapted, cutting, sewing, and modifying their equipment to make it functional. The training curriculum compressed years of normal aviation instruction into several months. Raskova knew the military situation demanded rapid deployment of her regiments. The German advance had slowed, but not stopped. Soviet forces desperately needed every available resource. Her regiments needed to complete training and deploy to combat as quickly as possible. This meant accelerating instruction, teaching essential skills first, and deferring advanced techniques until later. The Night Bomber Regiment trained specifically for nocturnal harassment operations. The Po-2 biplane, selected as their primary aircraft, was designed in the mid-1920s by Nikolai Polikarpov as a basic trainer and agricultural crop duster. The aircraft featured simple construction, using plywood for the fuselage and fabric covering the wings and control surfaces. 2 open cockpits accommodated pilot and passenger or instructor. The aircraft was powered by a Shvetsov M11 radial engine producing 100 horsepower, giving the Po-2 a maximum speed of barely 94 miles per hour and a service ceiling of approximately 11,000 feet. The Po-2 possessed numerous disadvantages for combat operations. It was slow, vulnerable to fighters, and carried minimal bomb load. It lacked armor protection, defensive weapons, or self-sealing fuel tanks. The open cockpits exposed crews to weather and made winter operations particularly miserable. The aircraft had no radio, preventing communication between planes or with ground controllers. Navigation equipment consisted of a compass, watch, and maps. The Po-2 was arguably the most primitive combat aircraft operated by any major power during World War II. But the Po-2 also possessed advantages for night operations. Its slow speed, normally a liability, became an asset at night. German fighters flying at normal combat speeds could not slow enough to engage Po-2s effectively without stalling. The biplane's wooden and fabric construction made it nearly invisible to early radar systems. Its small size and quiet engine allowed it to approach targets with minimal warning. Most importantly, the Po-2 could be flown from rough fields near the front lines, operated by crews with basic technical training, and maintained with simple tools and limited spare parts. These characteristics made it ideal for harassment bombing operations where quantity of attacks mattered more than individual bomb loads. The women learned to fly the Po-2 during daylight hours, mastering takeoffs, landings, basic aerobatics, and emergency procedures. Most students had previous flying experience, making initial training relatively straightforward. The Po-2 was forgiving, tolerating pilot errors that would cause crashes in higher-performance aircraft. Students progressed rapidly from solo flights to formation flying, navigation exercises, and practice bombing runs. Night flying presented greater challenges. The women learned to navigate by stars, using constellations as directional references. They memorized terrain features visible in moonlight, rivers, railways, roads, and towns. They practiced dead reckoning navigation, calculating courses and timing based on speed and wind estimates. They learned to read topographic maps in darkness, identifying targets from altitude. These skills required extensive practice, with students making mistakes and learning from them before mastering nocturnal operations. The bombing technique they learned was unlike conventional dive bombing or level bombing used by other bomber types. Because the Po-2 carried only 4 small bombs and lacked sophisticated bomb sights, accuracy depended on pilot skill and navigation experience. The typical attack profile involved approaching the target area at altitude between 3,000 and 7,000 feet, identifying landmarks, lining up on the target approach, cutting the engine, gliding silently toward the aiming point while the navigator calculated release timing, releasing bombs manually, immediately restarting the engine, and escaping at low altitude before German defenses could respond effectively. This technique required precise coordination between pilot and navigator. The pilot maintained proper glide angle and airspeed while approaching the target. The navigator identified the aiming point, calculated windage and release timing, and operated the manual bomb release. Both crew members needed to remain calm, despite knowing German anti-aircraft fire would begin moments after bomb release. Mistakes could result in missing the target, crashing during the glide, or being caught by searchlights and destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The students practiced these techniques repeatedly during training. They flew practice missions, dropping small training bombs on marked targets. Instructors evaluated their accuracy, technique, and ability to operate under stress. Those who excelled became first pilots. Those with exceptional navigation skills but less piloting ability became navigators. A few students failed to meet standards and were reassigned to ground duties, but most women completed training successfully, earning their wings and preparing for combat deployment. While pilots and navigators trained in the air, other women trained for ground duties essential to operations. Mechanics learned to maintain Po-2 engines and airframes, performing routine maintenance and repairing battle damage. Armorers learned to load bombs, checking fuses, and ensuring proper attachment to wing racks. Communications specialists learned to operate primitive field telephones and maintain contact with higher headquarters. Medical personnel trained to treat wounded crew members. Meteorology specialists learned to forecast weather conditions critical for mission planning. Every position required training, and every position would be filled by women. The decision to staff the regiments entirely with women reflected both ideological considerations and practical realities. Soviet doctrine emphasized equality between sexes and women's capabilities to perform any task men could accomplish. Creating all-female combat units demonstrated this principle in action, providing propaganda value domestically and internationally. Practically, using women for these units released male personnel for other duties. The Soviet Union faced severe manpower shortages in late 1941, with millions of men already serving in the Red Army and millions more needed. Every man released from training or support duties could join combat units fighting the Germans. But the decision also created challenges. Soviet military culture remained fundamentally patriarchal despite official ideology. Many male officers doubted women could handle combat stress. Some commanders openly questioned whether the female regiments would be effective or would require excessive support from male units. The women of the Night Bomber Regiment would need to prove themselves in combat before earning genuine respect from the military establishment. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment completed training in late April 1942. The women received their combat assignments, learning which crews would fly together and which aircraft they would operate. Each Po-2 required a pilot and navigator working as a team. These partnerships would prove crucial to survival, with crews developing deep bonds forged through shared danger. Many pilot-navigator partnerships lasted throughout the war, with the same two women flying hundreds of missions together. Yevdokia Davidovna Bershanskaya assumed command of the regiment. She was 29 years old, significantly older than most members of her regiment, and had extensive pre-war flying experience. Bershanskaya had learned to fly in the early 1930s and had worked as a flight instructor before the war. She possessed natural leadership abilities, earning respect from subordinates through competence and fairness rather than rank. Bershanskaya would command the Night Bomber Regiment throughout the war, fighting constantly to protect her unit from interference by male commanders who questioned women's abilities. Her leadership contributed significantly to the regiment's combat effectiveness and survival. The regiment deployed to the front in May 1942, initially supporting Soviet forces fighting German advances toward the Caucasus oil fields. The military situation remained desperate. German summer offensives were achieving significant territorial gains. Soviet forces were trading space for time, falling back to more defensible positions while inflicting maximum casualties on advancing Germans. Every Soviet unit, including the untested Women's Night Bomber Regiment, was needed to slow the German advance. The women flew their first combat missions on the night of June 8, 1942, targeting German troop concentrations near the North Caucasus front. The experience proved terrifying. German anti-aircraft fire was more intense than training had prepared them for. Searchlight beams swept the sky, trying to illuminate the approaching biplanes. Shells burst around the aircraft, filling the air with shrapnel. Several Po-2s sustained damage, but all returned safely. The missions accomplished their objectives, with bombs hitting German positions and forcing troops to take cover. German soldiers on the receiving end of these attacks initially dismissed reports of female pilots. Wehrmacht commanders assumed Soviet propaganda had fabricated claims about women flying combat missions. But frontline soldiers insisted the attacks were real, describing the eerie sound of approaching aircraft gliding silently through darkness. The sound resulted from wind whistling through the Po-2's wire bracing and struts, creating a distinctive swooshing noise unlike any other aircraft. German soldiers began calling the nocturnal attackers Nachthexen, night witches, comparing the sound to that of witches flying on broomsticks in German folklore. The name spread rapidly through Wehrmacht units facing the night bomber attacks. German commanders issued orders specifically mentioning the harassment by Soviet Po-2 units, directing anti-aircraft batteries to give priority to shooting them down. The German High Command offered rewards, including Iron Cross decorations, to any pilot or anti-aircraft gunner who successfully destroyed a night witch. This recognition reflected German respect for the threat posed by these nocturnal attacks, despite the primitive nature of the Po-2 aircraft. German anti-aircraft crews developed specific tactics for engaging night witches. They positioned searchlight batteries to create overlapping illumination zones, attempting to catch Po-2s in crossing beams. Once illuminated, an aircraft became easy target for anti-aircraft guns using optical sights. German gunners learned to listen for the distinctive sound of approaching biplanes, preparing to fire when they estimated aircraft were nearby, even before visual contact. They created kill zones with concentrated fire, forcing Soviet pilots to fly through walls of exploding shells. The night witches adapted their tactics in response. They learned to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, dividing German defensive fire. Lead aircraft would deliberately draw searchlights and anti-aircraft attention, while others attacked from darkness. Pilots developed evasive maneuvers, diving, climbing, and turning violently to avoid being caught in searchlight beams. Once illuminated, pilots would take immediate evasive action, making themselves difficult targets through violent maneuvering that pushed the Po-2 to its performance limits. A typical night's operations began well before sunset. Ground crews prepared aircraft, performing pre-flight inspections, loading bombs, fueling planes, and checking systems. Each Po-2 carried 4 FAB-50 or FAB-100 bombs, small high-explosive weapons weighing 50 or 100 kilograms. The bombs were suspended beneath the lower wings on simple racks. Armorers checked each bomb carefully, ensuring proper attachment and arming of fuses. A bomb falling off prematurely or failing to detonate wasted the mission and endangered friendly forces below. Pilots and navigators attended briefings where intelligence officers described targets, German defensive positions, weather conditions, and any special instructions. Targets varied widely, depending on tactical situation. Early missions primarily attacked German troop concentrations, artillery positions, and supply dumps near front lines. Later missions ranged deeper, hitting airfields, railway junctions, fuel depots, and command posts. Some missions supported specific Red Army offensives, hitting targets immediately before Soviet ground attacks. Other missions maintained constant pressure on German forces through harassment. After briefings, crews performed final preparations. They checked flight gear, ensured maps were current, reviewed navigation calculations, and mentally rehearsed the mission profile. Many crews developed personal rituals or good luck charms, small practices that provided psychological comfort before facing danger. Some prayed, others sang songs. Still others maintained silence, focusing inward. These pre-mission hours were tense, with adrenaline building and fear competing with determination. Individual crews took off after dark, climbing to cruising altitude while navigating toward target areas. The Po-2's slow speed meant that flights to targets 20 or 30 miles behind German lines took considerable time. Crews used this time to finalize navigation calculations, identify landmarks, and prepare for the attack run. They flew without radio communication, making each aircraft independent. If one plane was shot down, others would not know until returning to base for debriefing. Approaching the target area, pilots reduced altitude slightly and began searching for landmarks that would identify the precise target location. Navigators cross-referenced what they saw below with maps, calling out course corrections to pilots. When the target was positively identified and the approach properly aligned, pilots would cut the engine. The sudden silence was startling, with only wind noise audible. The Po-2 would glide toward the target, descending gradually, growing closer to German positions with each passing second. The navigator tracked time and distance, calculating the optimal bomb release point. This required skill and experience, accounting for aircraft altitude, glide angle, windage, and target characteristics. Release too early, and bombs would fall short. Release too late, and they would overshoot. The window for accurate bombing was narrow, requiring split-second timing. When the navigator determined the correct moment, she would manually operate the bomb release mechanism, sending 4 bombs falling toward the target below. As soon as bombs released, the pilot would restart the engine. The M11 radial engine sometimes proved difficult to restart, particularly in cold weather. Pilots would prime the engine, engage the starter, and pray it caught before the aircraft descended too low. A failed restart meant either attempting a forced landing in enemy territory or continuing the glide until reaching Soviet lines, hoping sufficient altitude remained. Most restarts succeeded, the engine coughing to life, the propeller spinning, power returning. Pilots would immediately turn away from the target and accelerate to maximum speed. German defenses would respond within seconds of bomb impacts. Searchlights would sweep the sky, seeking the attacking aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns would open fire, filling the air with exploding shells and tracer rounds. The escape phase of each mission was terrifying, with pilots maneuvering violently while navigators scanned the sky for threats. Shells burst around them, shrapnel tearing through fabric and wood, sometimes striking crew members. Searchlights would lock onto aircraft, illuminating them against the darkness, guiding anti-aircraft fire. Pilots caught in searchlights had to escape quickly or face destruction. The flight back to base was not safe either. German fighters occasionally patrolled at night, hunting for returning Soviet bombers. The fighters had advantage of speed and firepower, but difficulty engaging slow-moving Po-2s that could turn inside fighter turning radius. Most fighter attacks occurred near dawn, when returning bombers were silhouetted against brightening eastern sky. Po-2 pilots tried to complete missions and return to base before first light to minimize this vulnerability. Returning crews landed at their forward airfields, typically rough strips near front lines. Ground crews would immediately descend on each aircraft, refueling, rearming, and inspecting for damage. Pilots and navigators would drink hot tea, eat quick meals of bread and soup, and prepare for the next sortie. Turnaround time averaged 30 to 45 minutes. Most crews flew 5 to 8 missions per night during summer months, when darkness lasted approximately 8 hours. Winter operations saw even more sorties possible during extended darkness. The pace was exhausting. Pilots and navigators flew multiple hours each night under constant stress, operating on minimal sleep, eating irregular meals, enduring weather extremes. They flew in summer heat that made cockpits unbearable. in spring and fall rains that drenched open cockpits, and in winter cold that threatened frostbite despite heavy clothing. They flew with dysentery, influenza, and other illnesses. They flew injured, with wounds bandaged but not fully healed. They flew exhausted, pushing beyond normal human limits through determination and adrenaline. Nadezhda Valentinovna Popova exemplified the night witch's courage and dedication. Born in Donetsk, Ukraine, in 1921, she learned to fly as a teenager at a local aviation club. She had accumulated significant flying experience before the war and volunteered immediately when Raskova formed the women's regiments. Popova flew her first combat mission in June 1942 and continued flying until the war's end. She ultimately completed over 850 combat sorties, among the highest totals in the regiment. Popova's aircraft was shot down multiple times during the war. On one occasion, German anti-aircraft fire tore through her Po-2, shredding the fabric covering on wings and fuselage. The biplane became extremely difficult to control, with damaged surfaces creating turbulent airflow that threatened to tear the aircraft apart. Popova managed to maintain control through skill and determination, completing the mission before returning to base. Ground crews counted dozens of holes in the aircraft's structure. They worked through the night patching fabric and repairing damage so Popova could fly the same aircraft on missions the following evening. Another time, anti-aircraft shells struck Popova's fuel tank. The Po-2 lacked self-sealing tanks, meaning any penetration would cause fuel to pour out. Gasoline streamed from the ruptured tank, creating a highly flammable vapor trail. One spark from engine exhaust or static electricity would ignite the fuel, turning the aircraft into a fireball. Popova shut off fuel flow from the damaged tank, switching to reserve tank, and flew home on minimal fuel reserve. She landed successfully with nearly empty tanks, the aircraft running on fumes during final approach. Popova developed close partnership with her navigator, Katya Ryabova. They flew together for most of the war, completing hundreds of missions as a team. They learned to anticipate each other's actions, communicating efficiently through brief phrases over the intercom. Their coordination was nearly telepathic, with each understanding what the other needed without extensive discussion. This partnership was typical of night witch crews, with pilot-navigator teams developing bonds that lasted beyond the war. Irina Fedorovna Sebrova flew even more missions than Popova, ultimately completing over 1,000 combat sorties, the highest total in the regiment. Born in Moscow in 1914, Sebrova learned to fly in the early 1930s. She worked as a flight instructor before the war and volunteered for Raskova's regiments in October 1941. Sebrova participated in the defense of the Caucasus, flew missions supporting liberation of Crimea and Ukraine, supported advances through Poland, and flew final missions over Germany in April and May 1945. Sebrova's aircraft was shot down 4 times during the war. She crash-landed damaged Po-2s, escaped from burning wreckage, and returned to flying after recovering from injuries. She was wounded twice, once by shell fragments that tore into her leg, and once when bullets struck her shoulder. Both times, she spent minimal time recovering before insisting on returning to flight status. Medical personnel wanted her to take more time healing, but Sebrova argued her crew needed her and she needed to fly. Her determination was absolute. Sebrova received the Hero of the Soviet Union in February 1945 for her exceptional combat record. The citation praised her courage, skill, and dedication to duty. By that point, she had already completed nearly 900 combat sorties with months of war remaining. She continued flying until Germany surrendered, adding another 100 missions to her total. Sebrova's 1,000 combat sorties represented approximately 1 mission every 2 days throughout 3 years of war, an extraordinary pace maintained despite danger, exhaustion, and wounds. Yevdokia Nosal was another remarkable night witch who completed over 800 missions during the war. Born in rural Ukraine in 1923, Nosal learned to fly through her local aviation club. She was only 18 when she volunteered for Raskova's regiments and 19 during her first combat mission. Despite her youth, Nosal proved to be an exceptional pilot, with natural flying abilities and uncommon courage. She flew through intense anti-aircraft fire, survived being shot down, and consistently achieved accurate bombing results. On one mission, Nosal's Po-2 was caught by searchlights while attacking a German supply depot. Anti-aircraft fire immediately concentrated on her illuminated aircraft. Shells burst around the biplane, shrapnel tearing through wings and fuselage. One shell exploded directly beneath the aircraft, the blast wave flipping the Po-2 inverted. Nosal found herself hanging from her seat straps, flying upside down at low altitude in darkness. She recovered control through instinctive reactions, rolling the aircraft upright and diving away from the searchlights. The Po-2 survived despite extensive damage. Nosal returned to base and flew another 3 missions that same night. Rufina Sergeyevna Gasheva completed over 800 missions and received the Hero of the Soviet Union for her combat achievements. Born in 1921, Gasheva learned to fly before the war and became an experienced pilot. She flew combat missions throughout the war, surviving numerous close calls with German anti-aircraft fire and fighters. Gasheva developed reputation for exceptional bombing accuracy, consistently placing her bombs on target despite difficult conditions. Other pilots sought her advice on bombing techniques, learning from her experience. Gasheva flew one particularly difficult mission in August 1943, attacking a German ammunition dump near Novorossiysk. Intelligence reported the target was heavily defended with anti-aircraft batteries and searchlights. Previous attacks had been driven off by intense defensive fire. Gasheva volunteered to lead the attack, knowing the risks. She approached the target at very low altitude, hoping to get beneath searchlight coverage. German gunners detected her anyway, opening fire with everything available. Gasheva pressed the attack despite the fire, releasing her bombs directly on the ammunition dump. The resulting explosions destroyed the facility, setting off secondary detonations that continued for hours. Gasheva's Po-2 sustained over 20 holes from shell fragments, but she returned safely. Yevgenia Mikhailovna Rudneva served as navigator and completed over 700 combat missions. Born in 1920 in Ukraine, Rudneva studied astronomy and mathematics at Moscow University before the war. Her scientific background made her an exceptional navigator, capable of precise calculations even under stress. Rudneva used her astronomical knowledge to navigate by stars with remarkable accuracy, identifying constellations and using them for direction finding even in difficult weather conditions. Rudneva kept a detailed combat diary throughout the war, recording her missions, observations, and thoughts. The diary provides valuable first-hand account of night witch operations. She described the fear experienced during missions, the exhaustion from flying multiple sorties nightly, the grief when friends were killed, and the determination to continue despite everything. Rudneva wrote about the bond between crew members, the pride in their accomplishments, and their commitment to defeating fascism. Her diary survived the war and was published later, providing important historical document. Tragically, Rudneva was killed in action on April 9, 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender. Her aircraft was shot down during a mission over Poland. She had completed over 700 combat sorties, survived 3 years of constant danger, and died in the war's final weeks. Rudneva received the Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously. Her death devastated the regiment, reminding everyone that danger remained constant even as victory approached. The Night Witches faced German fighters on numerous occasions despite their nocturnal operations. Luftwaffe night fighter units equipped with Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft sometimes patrolled areas where Soviet night bombers operated. These encounters were extremely dangerous for Po-2 crews. The German fighters were far faster, better armed, and flown by experienced pilots. A Po-2 caught by a fighter had minimal chance of survival. But Night Witch pilots developed tactics that occasionally allowed them to evade or even survive fighter attacks. The Po-2's extremely slow speed paradoxically provided some protection. German fighters flying at normal combat speeds would overshoot the biplane, unable to slow sufficiently without stalling. Pilots attempting to engage Po-2s had to reduce speed dramatically, making their own aircraft vulnerable to stalling and loss of control. Some German pilots succeeded in slowing enough to engage Po-2s, shooting down several during the war. But most fighter encounters ended with the German pilot overshooting or breaking off the attack. Night Witch pilots also used maneuverability to evade fighters. The Po-2 could turn extremely tightly, outturning any fighter attempting to follow. Pilots caught by fighters would dive toward the ground, making violent turns at treetop height, where German pilots were reluctant to follow in darkness. Some Po-2s escaped by shutting off their engines and gliding silently while German fighters searched for them. Without engine noise to guide them, and with the Po-2's small size making visual detection difficult, German pilots often lost contact and broke off the search. One particularly dramatic encounter occurred in September 1943 when Galya Dokutovich was attacked by a German fighter near Taman. The fighter made a firing pass, machine gun bullets tearing through Dokutovich's Po-2. She immediately dove toward the ground, turning tightly, using the biplane's agility. The German pilot attempted to follow but pulled out of his dive too late, impacting terrain. Whether the pilot was killed by Dokutovich's maneuvering or simply made a fatal error remains unclear. Dokutovich returned to base with her damaged aircraft and reported the encounter. She became one of the few Night Witch pilots credited with destroying an enemy fighter, though the victory was achieved through defensive maneuvering rather than offensive action. The Night Witch's most common enemy was German anti-aircraft fire. Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe ground forces deployed thousands of anti-aircraft guns across the Eastern Front, ranging from light 20mm automatic cannons to heavy 88mm guns. These weapons posed constant threat to Soviet aircraft, shooting down thousands during the war. Anti-aircraft fire killed more aircrew than fighters on the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe's declining strength reduced fighter threat, while anti-aircraft defenses remained potent throughout the war. German anti-aircraft crews respected the Night Witches despite their primitive aircraft. The constant nocturnal harassment disrupted sleep, forced soldiers to take cover repeatedly, created stress and fatigue, and occasionally inflicted casualties when bombs hit troops or equipment. German commanders allocated significant anti-aircraft resources to defending against Po-2 attacks, positioning batteries to protect important targets and creating overlapping fields of fire. The anti-aircraft threat varied depending on target importance. Attacks on frontline positions faced relatively light defenses, mostly small-caliber guns fired on sound bearings without optical sighting. Attacks on rear-area targets like airfields, supply depots, and command posts faced heavier defenses, including searchlights and larger-caliber guns with optical sights. The most dangerous targets were those designated as critical by German High Command, receiving maximum defensive resources. Night Witch pilots learned to recognize and avoid the most dangerous defenses. They memorized locations of heavy anti-aircraft batteries and planned attack routes that minimized exposure. They attacked from different directions on successive missions, preventing German gunners from anticipating their approaches. They varied attack altitudes and timings, maintaining unpredictability. These tactics reduced casualties but could not eliminate risk. Anti-aircraft fire remained a deadly threat throughout the war. The regiment suffered its first combat fatality in July 1942, when Klavdia Fomicheva's aircraft was shot down by anti-aircraft fire near Krimskaya. Fomicheva had completed over 100 missions before her death. Her loss shocked the regiment, making concrete the dangers they faced. Until then, despite close calls and damaged aircraft, everyone had survived. Fomicheva's death proved they were mortal, that German anti-aircraft fire could kill them despite their skills and courage. More casualties followed throughout the war. Approximately 30 Night Witches were killed in action, shot down by anti-aircraft fire, caught by fighters, or lost in accidents. The casualty rate was remarkably low, considering the number of missions flown and the dangers faced. This reflected several factors. The Po-2's rugged construction allowed it to survive damage that would destroy other aircraft. The crew's exceptional skill and tactics reduced their vulnerability, and luck favored them more than most combat units. But each loss affected the regiment deeply. The women formed close bonds, stronger than those in many military units. They lived together, flew together, faced death together, and supported each other through fear and grief. When someone was killed, the entire regiment mourned. Memorial services were held when possible. Personal effects were packed and sent to families. New crews arrived to replace losses, young women eager to join the legendary Night Witches, but sobered by learning about those who had died. The regiment participated in every major Soviet offensive on the southern sector of the Eastern Front from summer 1942 through spring 1945. They supported the defense of Caucasus oil fields, preventing German capture of resources vital to Soviet war effort. They flew missions during Battle of Stalingrad, attacking German positions around the besieged city. They supported liberation of Crimea in spring 1944, flying hundreds of sorties against German defenders. They participated in advances through Ukraine and into Poland, bombing targets that supported Red Army ground operations. The Crimean campaign proved particularly intense. German forces occupied the peninsula for 3 years, establishing strong defensive positions. Soviet efforts to liberate Crimea required eliminating German fortifications and supply lines. Night Witches flew constant missions against German positions, supply depots, and troop concentrations. The short distances allowed crews to complete many sorties per night, maintaining intense operational tempo throughout the campaign. One mission during the Crimean campaign became legendary. On the night of May 5, 1944, multiple Night Witch crews attacked German positions near Sevastopol. Heavy anti-aircraft fire damaged several aircraft, but all completed their missions. One crew, pilot Yevdokia Davidovna Nosal and navigator Irina Alexeyevna Kashirina, flew 18 sorties in a single night, setting a regiment record. They took off, bombed targets, returned, refueled and rearmed in minutes, and repeated the cycle 18 times before dawn. Ground crews could barely keep pace with their turnaround demands. The sustained pace was exhausting, but Nosal and Kashirina maintained their effectiveness throughout, delivering accurate bombing on every sortie. After liberating Crimea, Soviet forces continued their westward advance. The Night Witches relocated frequently, following the moving front, operating from rough airstrips near the fighting. They became expert at rapid deployment, arriving at new bases and beginning operations within hours. Ground crews worked miracles maintaining aircraft under primitive conditions, often working outdoors in mud or snow with minimal tools and equipment. The regiment flew missions supporting Soviet advances through Belarusia, Poland, and eventually into Germany itself. As Soviet forces penetrated deeper into German territory, targets became more heavily defended. German anti-aircraft defenses in the Reich were formidable, having been developed to counter years of Allied bomber offensive. Night Witches attacking targets in eastern Germany faced the most intense anti-aircraft fire they had encountered during the war. But by this point, the women were combat veterans with years of experience. They had flown hundreds of missions, survived countless close calls, and learned their craft thoroughly. They approached German targets with confidence born from experience, knowing their tactics worked and trusting their skills. They still faced danger on every mission, but they no longer felt the overwhelming fear that had characterized their early combat operations. The regiment received Guards designation in February 1943, becoming the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The Guards title was reserved for units with distinguished combat records, recognizing exceptional performance. Receiving Guards status brought increased prestige, improved supply priority, and enhanced political standing. But it also brought higher expectations, with Guards units expected to accomplish the most difficult missions and maintain standards exceeding normal units. The Night Witches embraced their Guard status, wearing their insignia with pride. They had earned recognition through combat performance, not political connections or propaganda value. Their casualty rate, mission completion record, and combat effectiveness justified the Guards designation completely. They continued flying dangerous missions throughout the war, maintaining the high standards that had earned them recognition. Marina Raskova, who had advocated for creation of the female aviation regiments, did not live to see their greatest achievements. She died in January 1943, when her aircraft crashed during a mission near Saratov. Weather conditions were poor with low visibility and icing. Raskova's aircraft crashed into a riverbank, killing everyone aboard. Stalin ordered a state funeral in Moscow, one of only 3 individuals accorded this honor during the war. Raskova's ashes were interred in the Kremlin wall, the highest honor the Soviet Union could bestow. Raskova's death shocked the women she had inspired and led. She had been more than their commander. She had been their advocate, fighting military bureaucracy to create opportunities for women to serve in combat roles. Without Raskova's intervention, the female aviation regiments would never have existed. The women of the Night Bomber Regiment honored her memory by continuing to fight, proving that her faith in their capabilities had been justified. Command of the Night Bomber Regiment remained with Yevdokia Bershanskaya throughout the war. She provided stable leadership, earning respect from subordinates and superiors through competence and dedication. Bershanskaya fought constantly to protect her regiment from interference by male commanders who questioned whether women could handle combat stress. Some officers wanted to transfer female pilots to safer duties or reduce their operational tempo. Others wanted to integrate male pilots into the regiment, arguing that mixed units would be more effective. Bershanskaya resisted these attempts, insisting her women could fly combat missions as effectively as any male unit. She defended her pilots from unfair criticism, supported them when they struggled, and ensured they received proper recognition for their achievements. Her leadership style emphasized leading by example, sharing the same dangers and hardships as her subordinates. Bershanskaya flew combat missions herself throughout the war, refusing to remain safely behind lines while her pilots faced danger. Bershanskaya's relationship with higher command was complex. Some senior officers respected her and valued the night bomber regiment's contributions. Others viewed the female regiment as publicity stunt or social experiment, questioning its military utility. Bershanskaya navigated these political waters skillfully, focusing on her regiment's combat performance while minimizing bureaucratic conflicts. Her political skills were as important to the regiment's success as her flying abilities. The war's final months brought the regiment to Eastern Europe, and eventually Germany itself. They flew missions supporting Soviet assaults on Budapest, Warsaw, and finally Berlin. The regiment's last combat sorties occurred in early May 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. When the war ended, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment had flown over 23,000 combat sorties, dropped approximately 3,000 tons of bombs, and accumulated more combat missions than almost any other Soviet aviation regiment. The statistics were remarkable. 23,000 sorties represented an average of approximately 20 missions per crew member over 3 years of war. This sustained operational tempo exceeded most bomber units. The relatively low casualty rate, approximately 30 killed from an initial strength of 140, represented survival rate far better than most combat aviation units. The regiment's combat effectiveness, measured by accurate bomb delivery and successful mission completion, matched or exceeded male bomber regiments flying more capable aircraft. Recognition came through awards and decorations. 23 members of the regiment received Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor. This included pilots like Nadezhda Popova, Irina Sebrova, and Rufina Gasheva, navigators like Yevgenia Rudneva, and even some ground crew members whose contributions to the regiment's success earned recognition. Hundreds more received Orders of the Red Banner, Orders of the Red Star, and other combat decorations. Nearly every woman who served in the regiment and survived received at least one decoration. Individual pilots accumulated impressive mission totals. Irina Sebrova's 1,000 missions topped the list. Nadezhda Popova flew 852 missions. Yevdokia Nosel completed 802. Multiple other pilots completed 700 or more missions. These totals represented extraordinary dedication and courage, with pilots flying night after night despite exhaustion, fear, and danger. The transition to peacetime proved difficult for many night witches. The Soviet Union celebrated military victory, but expected women to return to traditional civilian roles. Female veterans faced discrimination in employment and education. Many night witches struggled to find civilian careers matching their skills and experience. Aviation careers were mostly closed to women after the war, with Soviet Air Force returning to pre-war policies prohibiting women from combat roles. Some former night witches found work as flight instructors or aviation industry employees, but most had to pursue entirely different careers. Some night witches faced skepticism about their combat service. Despite official recognition and documentation, some people questioned whether women had actually flown combat missions or whether Soviet propaganda had exaggerated their achievements. This skepticism was particularly hurtful to women who had risked their lives repeatedly, endured terrible conditions, and lost friends to enemy action. They had proven themselves in combat, earned military decorations, and achieved remarkable combat records, yet faced doubt about whether they had really served. Many night witches suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about missions, startled at loud noises, struggled with survivor guilt over friends who had died. Soviet society provided minimal support for veterans dealing with psychological trauma. Mental health treatment was limited and carried social stigma. Most night witches coped with their psychological wounds privately, talking only with other veterans who understood their experiences. Despite these challenges, most night witches lived productive lives after the war. They married, raised families, pursued careers, and contributed to Soviet society. They maintained contact with former comrades, organizing reunions where they could share memories with people who understood what they had endured. These reunions provided opportunities to honor fallen friends, remember shared experiences, and maintain bonds forged in combat. Nadezhda Popova married Semyon Kharlamov, a fighter pilot she had met during the war. They had 2 children and remained married until Kharlamov's death. Popova continued flying, though in civilian aviation rather than military service. She gave interviews about her wartime experiences, ensuring the Night Witch's story would not be forgotten. Popova lived until 2013, dying age 92. She was one of the last surviving Night Witches, carrying memories of the war until her final days. Irina Sibrova also married after the war and raised a family. She worked as an engineer, using her technical education in civilian career. Sibrova remained active in veterans organizations, speaking at schools and public events about the war and the Night Witch's contributions. She emphasized the importance of remembering those who fought and died, ensuring new generations understood the price of victory. Sibrova lived until 2000, dying age 86. Yevdokia Bershanskaya continued serving in the Soviet Air Force after the war, though not in flying capacity. She worked in military aviation administration, contributing her experience and expertise. Bershanskaya never forgot her Night Witches, maintaining contact with her former subordinates and advocating for their recognition. She died in 1982, age 71, having dedicated her entire adult life to aviation and military service. The Night Witch's story remained relatively unknown in the West for decades after the war. Soviet histories mentioned the female aviation regiments, but details were scarce and often embedded in broader narratives about Soviet military achievements. Western historians focused primarily on male combat units and major battles, overlooking the women's contributions. Only in recent decades has scholarly attention turned to examining the Night Witch's achievements, analyzing their tactics, combat record, and historical significance. Modern military forces study the Night Witches as examples of successful integration of women into combat roles. The Soviet Union's wartime necessity created opportunities for women that peacetime society might not have permitted. The women who seized these opportunities proved themselves capable of flying combat missions under extreme conditions. Their success challenged assumptions about gender limitations in warfare and demonstrated that courage, skill, and determination matter more than gender. The Po-2 biplane that Night Witches flew represented obsolete technology even during World War II. Modern military aircraft are exponentially more capable, faster, more powerful, equipped with sophisticated sensors, navigation systems, and precision weapons. But the fundamental challenges facing Night Witch crews remain relevant to modern combat aviation. Navigation in darkness, target identification, weapon delivery accuracy, surviving enemy defenses, and managing fear and fatigue still affect combat operations. The Night Witch's tactics demonstrated principles that transcend technology. Use terrain and darkness for concealment, attack from unexpected directions, maintain operational tempo to overwhelm defenses, accept calculated risks to accomplish missions, train intensively to build skills and confidence, foster unit cohesion to maintain morale under stress. These principles guided Night Witch operations and remain valid for modern military forces. The women who flew as Night Witches came from diverse backgrounds but shared common characteristics: courage, determination, patriotism, and willingness to serve despite prejudice and danger. They volunteered knowing they might die. They accepted primitive equipment and dangerous missions. They proved themselves night after night, mission after mission, earning respect through performance rather than propaganda. Their story matters because it reveals capabilities often underestimated or ignored. Women proved they could fly combat missions effectively, handle stress and danger, and maintain performance under extreme conditions. The Night Witches were not tokens or publicity stunts. They were combat aviators who accomplished real missions with real consequences, contributing significantly to Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. The legacy of the Night Witches extends beyond military history into broader social and cultural contexts. Their story inspired women globally who faced discrimination and limited opportunities. They demonstrated that courage and competence transcend gender. They showed that determination and skill matter more than stereotypes and prejudice. They proved that women could excel in roles society traditionally reserved for men. The Night Witches' impact on Soviet society was complex. Their combat service challenged traditional gender roles and demonstrated women's capabilities in male-dominated field. But Soviet society after the war largely reverted to pre-war gender norms, with women expected to focus on domestic roles. The contradiction between celebrating the Night Witches as wartime heroes while simultaneously limiting women's opportunities in peacetime reflected broader tensions in Soviet ideology about gender equality. Internationally, the Night Witches' story influenced discussions about women in combat. Other nations studied the Soviet experience, evaluating whether their own militaries should allow women in combat roles. Some countries began integrating women into more military positions, citing Soviet example as evidence that women could serve effectively. Other nations maintained restrictions, arguing that Soviet case was exceptional or that gender integration created more problems than it solved. The debate about women in combat continues in many countries. Some military forces now fully integrate women into all combat roles, including aviation, ground combat, and special operations. Other militaries maintain restrictions, limiting women to support roles or excluding them from direct combat positions. The Night Witches example remains relevant to these debates, providing historical evidence that women can fly combat missions effectively under the most demanding conditions. The Po-2 biplane that Night Witches flew has become an iconic symbol of their service. Museums across Russia display restored Po-2s, many painted in Night Witch markings. These aircraft draw crowds, with visitors marveling at the primitive construction and imagining the courage required to fly such aircraft into combat. The Po-2's simplicity contrasts sharply with modern military aircraft, highlighting how far aviation technology has advanced while reminding viewers that courage and determination mattered more than technology. Several Po-2s still fly today, maintained by aviation enthusiasts and historical organizations. These flying examples participate in air shows and commemorative events, providing living connection to Night Witch history. Pilots who fly restored Po-2s describe the experience as humbling, gaining appreciation for what Night Witches accomplished while flying these primitive aircraft night after night into enemy fire. Memorials and monuments honoring the Night Witches exist throughout Russia and former Soviet republics. These range from simple plaques to elaborate statues depicting female pilots and their aircraft. The monuments serve as gathering places for veterans and their families, sites for commemorative ceremonies on Victory Day and other anniversaries, and educational tools teaching new generations about the war and those who fought. The largest memorial to the Night Witches was dedicated in Moscow in 2002, depicting a bronze statue of a female pilot standing before her Po-2 biplane. The memorial includes plaques listing names of all Night Witches who received Hero of the Soviet Union decoration. Veterans attended the dedication ceremony, many in their 80s, wearing their uniforms and medals one more time. The ceremony was emotional, with surviving night witches remembering fallen comrades and taking pride in recognition of their achievements. Educational programs about the night witches have expanded in recent years as historians work to ensure their story is not forgotten. Russian schools teach about the female aviation regiments as part of Great Patriotic War curriculum. Documentary films have been produced, featuring interviews with surviving night witches describing their experiences. Books have been written, both scholarly histories and memoirs by participants, preserving first-hand accounts before the generation that fought passes away. International interest in the night witches has grown significantly. Books published in English, French, German, and other languages have introduced their story to global audiences. American and European filmmakers have produced documentaries. Museums outside Russia have mounted exhibitions about Soviet women in combat, featuring the night witches prominently. This international attention ensures the night witches' legacy extends beyond Russian borders. The night witches' story resonates particularly strongly with women. Young women interested in aviation cite the night witches as inspiration, proof that women can succeed in male-dominated fields. Female military personnel see the night witches as pioneers who opened doors for subsequent generations. Feminists point to night witches as example of women's capabilities when given opportunity to prove themselves. But the night witches' story also transcends gender, speaking to universal themes of courage, determination, and sacrifice. Men also find inspiration in their example, recognizing that the courage they demonstrated was remarkable regardless of gender. The night witches faced impossible odds, accepted terrible risks, and accomplished remarkable achievements. Their gender made their accomplishments historically significant, but their courage made them heroic. On the night of June 23, 1943, when Nadezhda Popova sat in her Po-2 waiting for darkness to deepen, she embodied courage that defined the night witches. She would fly into darkness toward enemy positions, face anti-aircraft fire and searchlights, drop her bombs, and return to repeat the process. She would do this 852 times before war's end, surviving against odds, accomplishing missions despite danger, earning her place in history. The night witches flew wooden biplanes against modern defenses. They operated without parachutes, radios, or armor. They faced anti-aircraft fire on every mission. They flew in all weather conditions. They accepted exhaustion, fear, and loss. They kept flying, night after night, mission after mission, until victory was achieved. Their aircraft may have been obsolete, but their courage was timeless. The bombs they dropped may have been small, but their impact was significant. The dangers they faced may be forgotten by many, but their achievements deserve remembrance. The night witches earned their place among history's most remarkable warriors, proving that courage knows no gender and that determination can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. 23,000 sorties, 3,000 tons of bombs, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, 0 male pilots. The night witches wrote a unique chapter in military aviation history, one defined by courage, determination, and the ability of women to excel in combat under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The night witches proved that women could fly combat missions effectively, contributing significantly to military victory. They demonstrated that gender did not determine capability, that courage and skill mattered more than prejudice and stereotype. They showed that women, given opportunity and proper training, could match or exceed men's performance in demanding military roles. Their legacy continues today in women serving in combat roles in militaries worldwide. Female fighter pilots, helicopter pilots, bomber pilots, and transport pilots trace their heritage to pioneers like the Night Witches, who proved it could be done. When people question whether women can handle combat stress, perform under pressure, or maintain effectiveness in dangerous situations, the Night Witches' record provides definitive answer. The Night Witches also demonstrated the importance of unit cohesion, training, and leadership in combat effectiveness. They succeeded not simply because they were brave individuals, but because they were well-trained team operating under effective leadership. Bershanskaya's command provided stability and advocacy. The intensive training prepared them for combat demands. The bonds between crew members created mutual support that sustained them through hardship. Modern military forces recognize these factors as critical to combat effectiveness. Unit cohesion, realistic training, and effective leadership remain central to military success. The Night Witches exemplified these principles, showing that they apply regardless of gender. Their example informs contemporary military training and leadership development programs. The Night Witches' story reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it and when given opportunity to try. The women who joined the 588th Regiment were not superheroes or specially gifted individuals. They were young women, many barely out of their teens, who volunteered to serve their country when it faced existential threat. They trained hard, supported each other, and did their duty despite fear and danger. Their ordinariness makes their achievements even more remarkable. The war transformed these young women, forcing them to mature rapidly, teaching them lessons about courage, friendship, loss, and survival that would shape their lives forever. They saw friends die, experienced terror repeatedly, endured physical and psychological hardship, and emerged changed. Some were strengthened by their experiences, carrying pride in their accomplishments through their lives. Others were damaged, carrying psychological wounds that never fully healed. All were marked by their service in ways that peacetime society could not fully understand. The Night Witches' relationships with each other provided crucial support during and after the war. The bonds formed in combat were stronger than most civilian friendships. These women had trusted each other with their lives, depended on each other in desperate situations, and shared experiences that created permanent connections. Long after the war, Night Witches maintained contact, attending reunions, visiting each other, maintaining friendships forged in fire. These relationships provided support during difficult post-war years when veterans struggled with trauma, discrimination, and reintegration into civilian society. Night Witches could talk with each other about experiences and feelings they could not share with people who had not served. They understood each other's nightmares, grief over fallen friends, and pride in their accomplishments. This mutual understanding was therapeutic, helping them cope with war's psychological aftermath. The Night Witches' families also carried the legacy of their service. Children of Night Witches grew up knowing their mothers had been combat aviators who had flown dangerous missions and helped defeat Nazi Germany. Some children felt pride in their mothers' achievements. Others struggled with having mothers who had seen and done things in war that left them emotionally distant or psychologically damaged. The intergenerational impact of the Night Witches' service affected families for decades after the war ended. The Night Witches' story is ultimately about human capacity for courage, about choosing to act despite fear, about commitment to causes larger than self. These women could have chosen safer roles, could have avoided combat, could have found ways to serve that did not risk their lives repeatedly. Instead, they volunteered for the most dangerous missions, accepted obsolete equipment, and flew night after night into enemy fire. Their motivation came from multiple sources. Patriotism drove many, with women determined to defend their homeland against invasion. Ideology motivated some, with communist believers committed to defending Soviet socialist system. Revenge animated others, especially women who had lost family members or seen their homes destroyed. Adventure appealed to some young women seeking excitement and opportunity to prove themselves. Most night witches probably combined these motivations in varying proportions. Whatever their initial motivations, the experience of combat transformed them. Fear became manageable through experience and training. Patriotic abstractions became concrete as they witnessed war's destruction and human cost. Ideological beliefs were tested by reality of combat, where survival often depended on practical action rather than political conviction. The adventure many had sought proved far more terrifying and exhausting than they had imagined. But through it all, the night witches continued flying. They adapted to combat demands, learned from experience, improved their tactics, and maintained their effectiveness. They did not quit despite losses, despite fear, despite exhaustion. They flew their missions, supported each other, and contributed significantly to Soviet victory. Their persistence and determination were as important as their initial courage. The night witches deserve remembrance not just as historical curiosity or example of gender equality, but as brave soldiers who served with honor and accomplished remarkable feats under terrible conditions. They were warriors who fought and died for their country, who accepted danger to protect others, who demonstrated courage worthy of respect regardless of their gender. Their story belongs in the broader narrative of World War II, not as footnote, but as significant chapter about human courage and sacrifice. The wooden biplanes they flew are gone, preserved only in museums or as rare flying examples maintained by enthusiasts. The airfields they operated from have been abandoned or redeveloped. The targets they bombed have been rebuilt. The physical traces of their war have largely disappeared, but their legacy endures in memories, in historical records, in monuments and memorials, and in the inspiration they provide to new generations. The night witches proved that courage knows no gender, that determination can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demands and opportunity allows. Their story will continue to be told as long as people value courage, admire determination, and remember those who sacrifice for others. The women who bombed by moonlight earned their place in history through 3 years of nightly combat, and their achievements will never be forgotten.